So I'm Madeline Wimmer. I'm the University of Minnesota Extension educator in the topic of fruit production, and I kind of do programming statewide. And I'm based out of the Rochester regional office. So I'm more based in the southeast of Minnesota, but I do programming statewide. This is going to be kind of a webinar format of a presentation today. I welcome you to put any questions you have in the chat. At this time, I'm planning to address those at the end of our talk. But please also know that you can Google me, you can find my email address, and you are welcome to reach out if you have any questions that I can address personally on your end as well. So let's get started here. So I'm going to be starting really with the basics, kind of doing a big introduction to what perennial fruit crops are. From there, we'll be moving into, why you might want to be diversifying your farm with fruit. I'll be talking a little bit about various fruit crops, some gateway fruit crops, what might be some good things to get started here. And then we'll go through a new tool that I'm presenting called the fruit production wheel, which really goes over all the different aspects of consideration when doing your fruit farm. So, Lauren, if you haven't started recording, Lauren is my assistant here today who's supporting me in this presentation, but you're welcome to start recording if you haven't recorded yet.
Yep, we are recording.
Sounds good. Excellent. Okay. So just for those, again, kind of giving this really basic start here, there are a lot of things that are technically fruits, and a lot of things that we might call a fruit that aren't necessarily a fruit. So, of course, that botanical definition of what a fruit is going to be, anything that's containing a seed. And of course, I have, some what are known as accessory fruits on here, like strawberries, where technically what we call the seed is actually the fruit of the strawberry. But that's a bunch of botanical information that you might not care about. And so in our society, what we usually call fruits is in the context of the culinary world. So oftentimes we are referring to fruits as something that are sweet, maybe they're a little bit tart and they also contain seeds. But if you're a vegetable farmer out there, you probably already are growing fruits, right? You're growing beans, you're growing tomatoes, peppers. So what I'm talking about today is really going to get into the topic of perennial fruit crops. And I do work with herbaceous perennials, right? And so that'd be, for those who grow rhubarb maybe on your farm or asparagus, you're already familiar with what an herbaceous perennial is, but it's something that's going to die back to the ground each year and then start to grow again in the spring. So I do work with strawberries. I've done a little bit of work with hops, but that's not something that I really specialize in. My larger focus is really on woody perennials. So these are going to be fruit crops that exist all year round and they don't necessarily die back to the ground. If you're really new to growing fruit and you're trying to think of reasons as to why you might want to start incorporating fruit on your farm, I always like to bring up this first point, which is adapting a legacy mindset. So, really thinking long term, thinking beyond the fiscal year, thinking beyond, one growing season itself. A lot of folks are used to working with annuals. And when you start to work with perennial woody fruit crops, you're going to be thinking about things in the long term. How far is something going to be growing out? What do I need to do to my land to really prepare it so that the plants that are planted there can last for a long time? And of course, having this diversity can do a lot for your market. Thinking about potentially bringing more people on site for agritourism or U-pick operations, adding things to a CSA box, having value-added options, which would be really referring to like processed goods like jams or other ferments. And then, there's a sustainability aspect of it that we're not disturbing the soil every year. And fruit crops can add a little bit of support to pollinators, but most fruit crops, depending on what we're talking about, are going to be blooming just once per year. And then I add this. So there's going to be gaps before and after most fruit crops bloom. And I added this point about climate resilience at the end because, we're bringing in a lot of like carbon reserves, and as long as you're not burning your trees and burning, your grapevines or your shrubs, every how many years if you're taking out an orchard. There is some research that shows that there is some carbon, at least carbon neutral capacity for growing fruit crops, which is kind of cool. So again, going back to this biology of a woody perennial, we're going to be dealing with a plant that is using the energy of the sun, using photosynthesis to grow. It's going to be creating more leaves as well, but it's also putting that energy into its root system, into its trunk, into its branches. And then it holds all of that energy in during the dormant season. So during the winter, the fall, early spring, until it starts to emerge and all that energy starts to come back out and cause buds to grow again. So, temperate fruit crops need dormancy. In order for them to fruit properly every single year, they need a certain amount of coldness. And I won't go, this is really going to be kind of a helicopter talk. I won't be going into a lot of depth in every single topic, but I do encourage you to, again, follow our newsletter and to, see other talks that you might be going to at different conferences to learn about these topics. So, in the fall, plants are going to, again, they're going to be pulling all that energy that they produce into themselves. And then they're going to go into dormancy, at which point they start to accumulate what's called a number of chilling hours. And this is a really rough science. So this isn't super accurate, and there isn't a lot of data out there about which varieties need X amount of chilling hours for all crops. But they need a certain amount of chilling hours, which is basically an hour between, every hour that has the temperature is going to be between 32 and 45 degrees. At some point, they've accumulated enough of these chilling units and they enter their next stage of dormancy, at which they're going to be more sensitive to environmental cues in order to wake up and to start to grow again. And that cycle repeats itself every year. So what are we talking about today when it comes to woody fruit crops? We're talking about tree crops, vine crops, and shrubs. And just kind of a heads up here, many of you are probably already familiar with this, but the top crops grown in Minnesota, apples are number one. We're the home of the Honeycrisp, and we have a major breeding program for apples. But we've also bred a lot of cold climate wine grapes, and more recently, we are now starting to release table grapes, which I don't have a lot of information on getting those as a commercially viable crop. But if you do have questions about that, I can address that by email. And then I would say third is probably going to be strawberries, and mostly June-bearing strawberries rather than day-neutral strawberries. Um, so other fruits that you might be considering growing are raspberries or currants, elderberries, even blueberries can do all right in certain parts of Minnesota and with the right support. And then there's some other crops like honeyberries. I get a lot of people who are really interested in peaches. I have a stone fruits up here. Plums are more likely to survive Minnesota winters, whereas peaches are going to be more on this marginally hardy list. And I have a couple of pictures of a grower, Dan Shield, who has Stone Creek Orchard. And Dan actually does grow peaches in high tunnels with a lot of effort to make sure that he is covering his tunnels and doing various things to really support it. So it is a high input process, something that he's found very rewarding. But again, just another list here of things that are really marginally hardy. Tart cherries more likely than sweet cherries. Papas maybe in the future. Same with Asian pears. And then just keeping in mind, just because apples are a top crop doesn't mean that every variety is necessarily going to be hardy enough to survive our winters. I'll say that growing fruit is kind of romantic, right? It's nice. We're producing seeds, we're having beautiful flavors and aromas and colors, but growing fruit itself is not always a romantic process. And that's because everybody wants your fruit. So, fungal pathogens, which cause diseases, are an issue, whether it's on leaves or whether it's on fruits themselves. There are bacterial diseases and viruses, and then wildlife can oftentimes become a bigger issue than people anticipate, especially for younger um, establishing crops, younger apple trees, and younger shrubs. So always keep those things in mind. And therefore, when thinking about growing fruit, you don't necessarily have to be having an aim to grow the most perfect fruit, but being able to set yourself up to know what you can expect from a crop if you are or not developing a spray program. So, for example, if you are not developing a spray program for apples, you might be dealing with apple scab, but there are going to be other things you can do, like mowing leaves, to kind of lower that chance of infection and also just setting up customer expectations, helping communicate, when something might be a little bit blemished, but it's not necessarily harmful. Or maybe you're working with somebody to produce cider or some other value added product. Thinking about, do you have the capacity to store your fruit or do you even need to? Maybe you're going to be getting it to market right away, but similar to what you're thinking about with vegetable production as well. Um, there's kind of, this whole paradox with growing fruits because the plant, its goal, right, is to produce seeds, to produce diversity within its offspring in order to have a stronger um, generation to come. Whereas when we're working as fruit growers, oftentimes our goal is right to grow fruit. And so we are expecting uniformity. We want our tree to be loaded with fruit, perhaps. And that's not always necessarily in alignment with how these trees evolved. So just something to think about. And then another point here is just to think about what is sustainable fruit production. So there's a lot of different areas in the beginning starting process of how you're going to be choosing and selecting varieties. Maybe you're finding varieties that are resistant to diseases, how you're preparing the land, how you're managing your crop. That really feeds into these different aspects of what sustainability is. How long does the site that you're managing last? Are you being environmentally friendly? Are you in alignment in ways where you're mitigating or adapting to risks that are happening based on climate change? And then thinking about your community as well as your worker health, your own well-being, your family's well-being, all of that. So now introducing to all the fruit production wheel. This is something that I've kind of been working on as a way to teach about sort of the multifaceted considerations for growing fruit crops. And this is really broken down into three segments here. Decisions for foundation, which includes choosing a variety and rootstock when that's necessary, thinking about how you're going to prepare your site, how are you going to be planting, and then establishing and training your crops. In-season management, which includes pest management, canopy management, pollination support, along with soil and nutrition management. And then yield and fruit quality kind of control there. So pruning and crop load management, harvesting and storage. And so we'll walk through all this, see where we get to today, but hopefully we'll get through all of these slides. So we'll start off here thinking about foundational decisions with crops, varieties, and rootstock selection. I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit about gateway fruits, and here's a list here that is a little bit subjective, but it's really based on management requirements, disease pressure, how aggressive a plant might be, right? So like raspberries can sometimes overspread, and that can be more of a pain in the butt than you want. And then site requirements. Like how blueberries require acidic soil. So, is that something that's going to be practical for you? So at the top of the list here, we have things like honeyberries, currants, gooseberries, juneberries, and elderberries. And then we go into crops like tart cherries and pears. Hard cider apples are on the easier side because blemishes are more acceptable, whereas the hardest that we have listed here are apples for fresh market. Although arguably grapes sometimes can compete with that spot. So again, this is pretty subjective. And then, day neutral strawberries are above Juneberry strawberries just because it's sort of a newer emerging crop that takes a little bit of time to really get a method down with. And I'd already mentioned blueberries and some of those requirements. And so when we go to market and we eat an apple, eat a blueberry, eat a grape, um, you're just eating the fruit itself. But when I think about fruits, I'm thinking about the plant that is producing the fruit. So when somebody says strawberry, I go June bearing or ever bearing or day neutral. And most commercial growers are not growing ever bearing strawberries, which have two harvests throughout the season. June bearing are going to have one harvest throughout the season, whereas day neutrals are going to be continuously harvested and treated like an annual crop every year. And so here I have another example where with blueberries, right, you have high bush blueberries, you have half high or hybrid blueberries, some of which were developed with our breeding program. And then you have low bush or wild blueberries. So when you're thinking, I want to grow blueberries, right, you need to think about, well, what type? And will that work for you? Will it work for you based on your environment that you're growing in and how you want to grow your crop? And then I have, examples of varieties under here, which are going to be, these varieties were bred. There's a number of varieties that were bred that are high bush blueberries. There are a number of varieties that are bred that are hybrid, and same with wild blueberries. So an example high bush blueberry would be Patriot. An example half high is going to be North Country, and then Brunswick is a variety of low bush blueberries. Um, and I just really encourage you all, to talk with other farmers. So, what varieties worked for them, but then also keeping in mind that your site is going to be different than someone else. So, knowing why something worked for somebody is really going to fill in that gap of understanding if something will actually work for you as well. Um, so yeah, there's just going to be a number of reasons why you might choose a specific variety based on the rootstock, climate or site compatibility, how easy it is to manage, whether consumers enjoy this fruit type or not, and then how you're going to be using it along with the overall quality and ability to store that crop. For those who are not familiar with rootstocks, many fruit trees, especially apples, are going to be grafted. And throughout the United States, where people grow grapes, many grapes are also grafted. But in the upper Midwest, cold climate wine grapes, for example, and cold climate table grapes are not usually grafted, which is really advantageous because we have very cold winters here. So sometimes you will have a vine die all the way back to the ground and you can retrain it with shoots that emerge from the ground because you know that that's not coming from a different plant variety that is the rootstock. But why are we using rootstocks if, there's kind of this disadvantage sometimes to having suckers that are not the variety that you want to be growing? Well, especially for apple trees, they're going to change the tree's size and they're going to change how quickly that tree comes into bearing fruit. So instead of waiting 5 to 8 years for an apple tree to bear fruit and having a tree that's 15 to 20 feet tall, you might be working with a tree that is much shorter and starts to bear fruit within 2 to 3 years of its lifetime after planting. And this is important to keep in mind, with your rootstock because certain rootstocks work better with certain soil types. Some are more cold hardy than others are. Some are disease resistant or resistant to certain pests, for example. And so this is just a picture again, or not again, but just a picture showing two trees side by side, and B would be showing how an apple tree is propagated, where it is actually grafted onto its rootstock. So yeah, how long it begins to bear is going to depend on the rootstock that it's on. And we won't go into depth on the concepts of juvenility and arrested adulthood in this talk, but those are some, again, botany kind of nerdy words in there. So again, when do you want to be harvesting? And if you are already a vegetable grower, this is really important to keep in mind because you don't necessarily want to be harvesting at a time that you're supposed to be planting, or you don't have labor to harvest, for example. So there are certain earlier crops like haskap, which is another name for honeyberries on here. And then you have crops that are really going to be pushing over towards fall harvest, grapes and apples, where apples, there's a wide variety at which they are harvested. And strawberries, why is there this huge window here? Because it's covering both June bearing and day neutral strawberries. So as I mentioned, June bearing strawberries in Minnesota, we're going to be getting a harvest period maybe late June going into July. But when it comes to day neutral strawberries, you're going to get a harvest that starts to pick up and really goes into the fall. So when is something going to be harvested is a good question to ask. And then just to mention again, most of us, especially kind of considering this talk here, you already have your site selected. So again, most people are not in the market to find the perfect land. So it's really important to think about finding a crop that's going to work with your land so you're not fighting that the whole time that you have it. If you're not familiar with the USDA hardiness zones, this map has been updated more recently. So in 2023, this was
And
updated.
then
Oh,
what? I can't shut this off. Okay. All right. What you up to?
all right. So basically, what does the hardiness zone tell us? It tells us it's based on a 30-year average. So it's not necessarily always going to be accurate from year to year, but it gives us kind of this larger average of what the coldest temperature can be expected in the middle of winter time. And so you'll see hardiness zones connected to certain fruit varieties. And this is important to be paying attention to. But again, there's not really a guarantee that just because something is that hardy that it's going to survive because these are averages. So they're trends from year to year. And then other things to think about with site compatibility, thinking about, what your actual site is as compared to what your region trends are like. Thinking about light availability and the length of your growing season. So when is the first frost date or the last frost date of spring and the first frost date of fall? Um, there are potentials for false springs that can happen where you get warm-ups late in the winter or early spring, and then all of a sudden you get a cold snap and you're getting crop loss due to that. So a lot of things to think about. How much rainfall do you get on an average year? Do you have access to irrigation? So what do you want to think about when it comes to site preparation, your planting layout, and then training or establishing your crop? Again, just, to emphasize this, many fruit crops or, if you're working with strawberries, right, we're kind of in a little bit of a different place because you'll be rotating even a June bearing field, once every 4 to 5 years. But most fruit crops are going to be staying put in the ground after planting. So you really want to be planning and preparing for that thoroughly. We often recommend that you get a soil test of any site that you're going to be planting on. And then to take time to adjust your soil fertility and potentially the pH of your soil, for example. So you might be using cover crops or other methods, potentially using herbicides to eliminate weeds. This is a really great thing to invest your time into. And the weeds that you have on your site might depend on whether you're planting into something that was originally perennial, like if it was a pasture versus if you're planting over a field that was recently disturbed or had annuals planted in it. So knowing, which weeds are your biggest problem and addressing them accordingly is going to be helpful. And then we'll talk more about planting layout, but you'll want to choose something to plant between your rows. Having just pure dirt in between rows, which I get disappointed when I go out to California, for example, and see the vineyards out there where there's a lot of just dirt in between rows, although they get less rainfall, so erosion isn't as big of an issue. I think, again, whether you're choosing grass or a mixture of grass and some type of cover crop, finding something that can be in these aisles that doesn't necessarily compete with your plants is really helpful. Flat land is sort of a depressing um, like component of a site for fruit crops. So any, especially flat land with soil that's very dense and doesn't drain as well, heavy clay soils is going to lead to what we call wet feet. So that saturated soil can suffocate roots, and that's not really helpful. It can also impact how nutrients are taken up, increase disease issues, and all sorts of issues. So when thinking about a planting site, slope is okay and it's actually helpful again for drainage. But being aware of any low spots that could create frost pockets, or if you are on a slope, if there's a forest at the edge of that slope, that can also create what people will call frost dams. So basically, cold air sinks down to those areas, and during the springtime, maybe you have more, shoot death, or you have blossom death due to frost injury. And again, just knowing about your soil type, the texture and fertility is going to be important. This is just a soil map here of Minnesota showing general trends in soils. And so you can see kind of in our southern region, we have more silty type soil, which can be richer in organic matter compared to other areas. And organic matter is important because it helps to hold on to a lot of nutrients that your plants need. So pure sand, for example, can't really hold on to nutrients. It's kind of there, as a textural element that allows for good drainage, whereas things like clay, as well as organic matter, can help hold on to nutrients that can exchange with the root system. Your soil pH is also really important. As I mentioned, the acid-loving blueberries. You really want to be paying attention to what your soil pH is there. But ideally, your crop that you're looking at will have a specific range that it works well with for its pH. And this helps with, nutrient uptake. Mostly, we can see this graph here where you can see kind of different ranges where certain nutrients are taken up. And, where is the point where you can realistically amend your soil pH? If you're above 7.8, that's kind of that cutoff there where it's going to be really difficult to try to bring the pH down to a good range. And at that point, you might be seeing things like iron deficiency. The NRCS Web Soil Survey is also a really nice tool. It's not necessarily going to get into the nitty-gritty like a soil test would, but it is something that can help you understand a little bit about your soil type. But there are a number of different, at the University of Minnesota, you can get a soil test done, and then there are other labs as well where you can get soil tests done. So we recommend doing soil testing every 3 to 5 years, as well as before you plant. And we do have a video on YouTube that goes into some information about how to do this. Um, so there is information out there about how to collect your soil test. And then this is just an example soil test that you would get back from the University of Minnesota. Other labs are going to be giving you different outputs, but they're still going to be giving you similar information here. So you'll get usually a lot of the nutrient values are going to be in parts per million. And then you might get some comments or suggestions related to the crop when you tell them which crop you're in. You'll understand your soil pH. Usually will not get a soil test that tells you about your nitrogen levels in your soil, but you will know a little bit more about your organic matter. And there's usually different grades of tests, so you can add on more information if you're curious about micronutrients like zinc and boron, for example. And so this is kind of a cool graph here. This shows you how much soil organic matter or how much nitrogen is released every year in pounds. So you can see this vertical column here in pounds based on your percent soil organic matter. So you can see as that percentage goes up, you're going to have more and more pounds of nitrogen, roughly speaking, released every single year. So if you do have low organic matter in your soil, you might be thinking more about how can I start to actually address that by applying nitrogen or other sources of nutrition. Phosphorus deficiency in some parts of the country is more of an issue, but in Minnesota, it's pretty rare. So you just want to be careful. You don't necessarily want to over apply phosphorus, especially with concerns about runoff. But soils, if you do have a very sandy soil, that's kind of where you might start to see deficiency showing up. Again, going back to this whole conversation about weed pressure, are you planting over an annual rotation or perennial pasture or turf? That's going to change what weeds are already there or under high pressure. And then just remembering that young fruit crops really do benefit from more weed control. Oftentimes, especially crops like grapes, by the time that they're mature or very large apple trees, it's probably not going to be a big deal if you're intensively or not as intensively managing weeds. But when they are younger, this can be really helpful to get them off to a good start. So there are going to be chemical options and non-chemical options, especially if you are growing organically. You might be interested in some non-chemical options, thinking about mulch. Like that's a basic way to be shading out weeds, as well as, hand management for very small stands. There are actually some tillage equipment that can be used for fruit crops to non-invasively work with weeds. But there are usually fewer choices if you're not working with the herbicides, which of course, not working with herbicides, there's going to be so health differences if you are doing tillage, but in general, it's going to be a little bit better for the environment to try to at least be strategic about how you use herbicides or to use less in general. So here's this concept of the plant management zones. You have your planting row, which is going to be where all of your trees are planted. And then you do want to think about what's adjacent to your planting row, along with what is going to be the alleyway in between rows. So here's a chart here that shows how many plants you're going to be able to fit in per acre based on the spacing between trees. This is from Cummins Nursery, which sells a lot of apple trees commercially and is a good source for that. So you have your spacing between trees in which you're going to be anticipating how far will this grow out. With grapevines, there's usually recommendations for spacing based on the vine vigor rather than the anticipated size that it will get to. Um, and then the spacing between rows, again, you won't want to just think about your aisle spacing. You want to think about that spacing underneath your trees or underneath your shrubs. How far does that go out? And with that, basically from tree to tree, that's going to be the spacing in between rows, not just the actual aisle of grass that you're going to have there. So these types of charts can be really helpful for estimation. And then, are you going to need a trellis? So, trellises are required for some fruit crops, and they're an added expense. There's also just kind of a learning curve for how you're going to construct it and maintain it. Are you using wooden posts? Are you using metal? There are even concrete posts that can be used. And then there's a number of materials to train plants to the trellis. And here's just, again, a spectrum to show you. Crops that do not require trellises, looking at upright fruiting shrubs like blueberries, perhaps, aronia berries, currants, and then it kind of keeps going here where you might need to be using staking, for example, for semi-dwarf trees, some smaller trees, but not necessarily a trellis. And then there's going to be bramble crops, which are going to be like your raspberries, for example. If they're very upright, maybe they don't need a trellis, but they might benefit from a very basic trellis, especially if they're outside. But ones that are trailing, a little bit more downward growing, might need a little bit more support. And then you have things like actual dwarf high density apple trees, which are going to need really tall trellises to support them, especially if you're doing specific types of training with them. And then fruiting vines, and I have vines up here too. People ask about hardy kiwis sometimes, which are technically vines, but for the most part, you can just call them vines, and that's okay. So, how are you going to be planting? Again, small stands, totally okay to be using a shovel. Um, Augering is an option, but it can cause some compaction sometimes, so that's something to be aware of. And then, of course, for bigger operations, or if you have a neighbor who has a planting machine, here's just a picture from Ferguson's orchard in Wisconsin showing them and their method of doing this planting behind this tractor here. Um, yeah, you'll want to make sure that plants are well watered after planting. And then if you hadn't planted an alleyway before, that's kind of that time period to do it. If you are working with grafted trees, it's going to be important to think about where is that graft union. You don't want to bury the graft union because at that point, you will lose the actual power of the rootstock itself. So, general recommendation to dig as wide as the roots are to prevent any girdling. Just like with any other type of plant, you don't want those roots circling and then cutting off their own energy and oxygen there. So, and then, just thinking about again that graft union. The higher up you plant a graft union, the more power the rootstock has. Whereas, yeah, the lower it is, a little less power that it has. Sometimes some sites you'll have trees that sink a little bit after planting, so you'll want to pay attention after you plant, not just leave and assume everything's all good. Here's a picture of some grapevines after the first year has finished. So grapevines, you're usually going to be getting them as little cuttings, and you're going to be growing out shoots. Those shoots will grow up to hopefully the trellis wire, and that's kind of your first year of establishing the trunk. And then after that, you're going to be growing out more shoots to establish the arms of the vine, and it goes like that year after year. Again, stay tuned if you're interested in grapes specifically. I can talk more about that in a different talk, but just in general, recognizing that there is a process for establishing a fruit crop. And there are some that really don't need a lot of training. Maybe you're just pruning off some weak wood for blueberries or honeyberries, letting brambles grow out. But fruit trees and grapevines need a lot more training. And here's again some examples of having freestanding trees. So over here on your left, you'll see freestanding trees without any support. And then we have a little bit more dwarf-sized trees that are staked, and as well as fully trellis trees on what we would call a tall spindle system. So there are no permanent scaffold main branches on these trees. They're basically just, growing straight up, and then you're rotating the branches out. And the whole point of that is that you're bringing the trees closer together and you're maximizing yield, and you're really bringing yield up to speed a lot faster because these trees are coming into bearing within 2 to 3 years. So again, just kind of looking at this as requirements. If you do have these larger trees, because they're not setting fruit, they have a lot of energy to put towards growing vegetation, growing branches and shoots. So pruning is helpful to guide their growth. Oftentimes I'll hear people say, okay, my trees have been in the ground for 5 years. I'm ready to prune. Well, you can start to prune a lot earlier than that in order to select what you want the main branches to be. When you prune earlier, you're making smaller wounds, and you're really just guiding the growth out, trying to bring sunlight in, so that you can have good fruiting buds developing earlier on. And then, of course, that's all going to be important. I have the branch positioning on here. I'll mention that too. So branch position would be like helping apple trees weigh down their branches. Again, when they have a lot of energy to put into growth, oftentimes that growth will be upright. And because they're not fruiting very early, yeah, those branches are not being weighed down by fruits. So sometimes there are methods you can use to weigh down branches to reduce how quickly the branches grow and start to shade everything out, but also just to create stronger branches because the angle of a branch, when it's more upright, more vertical, it's more likely to snap from weight or impact or wind of some sort. So I mentioned the training poles for these semi-dwarf central leader trees. And then, all of a sudden you're not necessarily doing any branch positioning for dwarf trees, but you're still going to be doing some pruning to make sure that you have a single leader growing up. And then you might have that trellis system again. So now we're going to get into the topic of in-season management here, thinking about soil and water nutrition management first. As I mentioned earlier, just another brief mention that it's going to be helpful probably to take a soil test every 3 to 5 years or sooner if there's a problem. Nutrient deficiencies show up in fruit crops. In some crops, there are certain nutrient deficiencies that show up that don't show up in other crops. For example, here's an apple in the corner showing what we call bitter pit. And this relates to calcium deficiency in the fruit, but it's more complicated than just having calcium deficiency in your soil. It has a lot to do with interactions of nitrogen, potassium, and calcium within your soil, but it also has to do with how many fruits are set on a plant and how quickly vegetation is growing. So calcium is kind of a funny nutrient where it goes along the waterway, and so how does water get pulled from one part of the plant to the other? It's usually through respiration. So basically, if water is leaving leaves, which it is through transpiration, it's going to be pulling a lot more water. It's pulling more calcium, but fruits are not transpiring quite as much. So they're less efficient with calcium. So that's, again, these are heavy topics. Every slide here could go into a whole presentation on something, but something to think about. Here's another picture that a grower had sent to me, and it turned out these are his strawberries that he's trying to establish, that this site had a pH above 8. And what we're seeing here is an iron deficiency. So this is really unfortunate because probably a little bit more difficult to correct at this point. As you remember me mentioning, pHs above 7.8 are less likely to be able to be correctable. But basically, if you're looking for a nutrition deficiency, you're looking for chlorosis, so light colored leaves. This is a very specific type of chlorosis, and this light green coloring with dark veins in between. Poor growth, right? If there's not enough nitrogen, you get usually issues with growth. And then there's things like boron deficiency and zinc deficiency, which are those micronutrients that are going to be helping with pollination and fruit set. And so you might see weird things like zigzag patterns or, like I said, poor fruit set. Um, so if you think you're seeing a nutrient deficiency, you can try to do a petiole or plant tissue nutrient sampling. And there are a number of crops that this can be done with. When you do a sample, it has to be done a specific time of year because you need sort of a reference for what those nutritions normally are at that time of year based on and compared to what your nutrients you're seeing. And then, yeah, having recommendations for how much to correct after that. Sometimes I think we're catching up a little bit with that as well from the University of Minnesota side. There are a lot of different ways to apply nutrients. A lot of granular nutrients, chemical nutrients are going to get into the soil a lot quicker, but that doesn't mean that you can't go for organic options of top dressing. It's just that if you do have major issues, again, it's going to be best to address this before planting if you can. Timing, thinking about nitrogen, not over applying nitrogen towards the fall. Nitrogen can stimulate growth, for example, and when it stimulates growth in the fall, then you have issues with the plants going into dormancy. But again, this is just one topic here. Sometimes I hear people like when they're first growing fruit crops, they're concerned about getting nutrition into the aisleway where the grass is. And depending on what you're growing and how extensive the root system is, for example, grapes, some of those roots are going to be underneath the grass in the aisle. So are you losing nutrients if you're not just targeting under the row of plants itself. Not always, but maybe you will want to do something that is more targeted where you're trying to really get under that plant row rather than into the aisles, depending on the nutrition and the need, how expensive the product is, and if you're worried about runoff. So again, just something to think about. When are you wanting to install drip irrigation or use something like fertigation, for example? High density apple production, smaller trees means smaller roots. So they're going to dry out a lot faster. They're going to be in higher demand for irrigation. We've seen droughts occur more frequently in the past few years. So that's, again, a consideration. You know your site. If you're struggling with that, maybe having a water source and thinking about irrigation is going to be helpful for you. So again, plants with small root systems, as well as establishing plants. So again, grapevines, once they're really established, they have very much lower demand for water than when they're first getting established. Um, and then landscape fabric, people will ask about this. And again, it's a tool that can be used. It has its own issues because, how are you going to get nutrients in there? How are you going to get as much water infiltration depending on the product being used? Going into pollination support here. Flowers, there's a lot of beautiful flowers for different fruit crops. Um, but as I mentioned, there's usually going to be like a single flowering period, unless you're working with fall-bearing raspberries, which are going to continuously fruit, or day-neutral strawberries, which continuously fruit. So you're providing a little bit for pollinators at a small period of time. But in general, what does it mean to have a pollination requirement? Well, not all fruit crops are self-fertile, which means that they don't all like their own pollen. Again, the whole goal for making fruit is to make seeds. Plants want their seeds to have diverse genetics, so it makes sense that a lot of fruit crops would not necessarily like their own pollen because they want that diversity in their genetics. Apples and pears, plums, and blueberries do require um, pollination based on insect pollinators. And then we have other crops that really just benefit, from insect pollination. There's some that might benefit, but it's a little bit less clear. And then grapes are wind pollinated. So, they don't necessarily need a lot of pollinators on site in order to be pollinated. They're also perfect flowers that actually do like their own pollen for the most part. There are some varieties that are female only, and that need what would be called a pollinizer, a pollen donor. So again, this is just another slide here showing this here, where you have one flower that's giving pollen, one flower that's receiving pollen based on the need for cross-pollination, which means that you need at least two varieties. And sometimes these varieties can be closely related for things like apples, but for a crop like honeyberries, you actually need to make sure that the honeyberries are more distantly related, or you still might not get good fruit set. So at least two varieties. And then those two varieties should really be flowering around the same time. If you have one variety flowering and then all of a sudden it's done, and then the next variety is flowering, or there's very little overlap, all of a sudden there's not a lot of time for that pollen to exchange from one flower to the next. So there are other reasons, though, for a lack of fruit or no fruit at all. Shading, again, is going to be an issue, which is why, when we get into pruning here, pruning is so important to bring in sunlight because sunlight cues it's a good place for a plant to be creating fruiting buds. If it's taking a long time to get to maturity, again, some of those larger apple trees may not start producing fruit for a number of years. If you have kind of a general decline of your plant, you have old wood, like especially for blueberries, after 5 years, these branches are going to be less and less productive. So you may need to rejuvenate that wood. If there's cold injury to fruiting buds or the flowers themselves, nutrient deficiency, as I mentioned, a lack of pollinators, and then poor weather during pollination, which could be rain, but also like last year we had really high temperatures, very warm weather during pollination, and that meant that we had a very short pollination window, as well as some of those temperatures are not favorable for certain pollinators. Um, there goes the bee. So we do have this really great technical guide that's out. If you see me at a conference this year, I have some that are actually hard copies of this, but this can be found on our website. It's called Supporting Pollinators in Agricultural Landscapes. And this is just hot off the press. We were collaborated with Pollinator Partnership to do this. It's a little bit bigger of a guide, but we also have something on our website called the Pollinator Management Plan. And both of these tools can be used to help you determine how you're going to potentially support managed pollinators like hives or wild pollinators. There's a lot of cost share programs out there that can help you install pollinator habitat to support pollinators on your site. So I highly encourage that you look into those programs. And again, like your crop is probably blooming just once in the year. And so if you do have pollinators on site, what is giving them all those resources for the rest of the year? And just a note of, thinking about being strategic with pesticide applications, whether you're using organic pesticides or conventional ones, anything that can harm pollinators. Even off-site, right, which is something with our neighbors we don't always have a lot of control with. These are all things to think about. One good practice is to be spraying either before dawn or after dusk, which is not my preferred time to be out. Prefer to be sleeping at that time, but that's a really good practice to really help protect pollinators on site. What is canopy management? You may have heard this term before. Canopy management really has to do with in-season practices to manage the canopy of your fruit crop. And a crop like grapes has a lot of different tasks that can be considered canopy management. You might be thinning shoots early on in the season to try to control how many shoots you have per foot of your trellis system. And that's a really great practice to do, especially when they're really early. Again, the timing of management is everything with fruit crops, um, from their whole lifespan to just every single year, as well as things like fruit thinning, leaf pulling to expose fruits. And again, that's mostly going to be for grapevines. But then summer pruning or green pruning is going to be doing pruning when shoots are green. And then strawberries, June bearing strawberries, you're going to be thinking about bed renovation where you're mowing after the last strawberry is picked, and then managing runners for day neutral strawberries and for June bearing in certain circumstances. Pest management, again, another huge topic. And we won't get into much depth in this talk here, but just thinking about, your crop, especially if you're starting with one fruit crop, which is a really great idea. Um, it's all about having enough knowledge, understanding your values and goals, and then taking time to set out traps for pests that you can trap, and then track them and maybe do field scouting. And then thirdly, deciding how you're going to manage them, taking action, and then assessing how well did that work. So what would you need to know about certain pests related to your crop? Sometimes you might want to know the scientific name, but oftentimes it's important to know the life cycle. When do they usually arrive? What part of the plant do they target? What time of year are they not on site anymore? If you're trapping, once you catch how many in a trap, how many days after that are you going to want to spray? And what type of control methods are really available for that pest? Is it only chemical? Do you have other options? These are different traps that are available. So you kind of have these very basic 2D sticky traps. They come in different colors, but yellow is very common. Funnel traps that can oftentimes be used for Japanese beetles, but sometimes they can cause more harm than good because they can be good to help you indicate when to spray, but oftentimes they do bring more on site, and Japanese beetles are kind of their own pest. Yeah, So that's something to always think about. Winged and delta traps, codling moth, a lot of moths or lepidopterans, pests. These can be really helpful for them, and they work well because of their shape. And then also the spherical sticky ball trap, which is often used for apple maggot. So, different trap features, right? You might be thinking about putting a lure in one of these traps, which is going to dramatically increase how effective they are. But again, we're trying to trap to be aware of what's on site and to track populations, not to attract and kill in this scenario here, not to trap and kill in that way. So, attracting and kill would be a trap that has a pesticide on it that the insect gets and then it leaves and dies. And then some traps are actually meant to trap them inside and kill them. So for field scouting, what does that mean? It means that you're actually going out, you're looking for the pathogen, or you're looking for a pest itself, or you're looking for signs of a pathogen or symptoms that might be indicative that that pathogen is out there, or even that an insect pest is out there, how much leaf area is being chewed on, etc. So you'll want to keep a good notebook, a good log, dates of what you might be seeing. There are these compendiums of diseases and pests for different fruit crops, and these can be really helpful. You're always welcome to reach out to me as well during the growing season and beforehand if you're seeing something that you're not sure what it is. I might not always be sure either, but I can help you direct you to the right resource, and sometimes I can lead to certain articles being written in our newsletter, and that can help inform other people as well. So I encourage you to reach out. And then again, here's what I call the IPM, Integrated Pest Management Toolbox, which integrated pest management is not the same as organic management, but it's basically working to make sure that you're saving your crop, but you're also keeping the environment in mind. You're preventing any resistance. So you're strategically managing pests on site. So things like physical, I'll mention netting in a moment here. Cultural has to do a lot with the concept of sanitation, but even again, how you prune, how you bring sunlight and airflow into your crop, that's all going to matter if you are mowing leaves at the end of the season, again, to help prevent apple scab, to promote decomposition of those leaves and those spores. And then there's chemical management, which is going to encapsulate pesticides. Behavioral management is really, a good example would be mating disruption. So, coddling moth for apples, that's one example where mating disruptive tools exist. Whereas biological management is going to be you have something preying upon your pest. So there's going to be predatory insects that can eat your pests, like predatory mites can eat pest mites, for example. And then you have parasitoids, which they're going to lay eggs in your pests, which will then hatch and destroy the pest. Hail netting is something that the University of Minnesota has talked about and done research about. And it can be used for insect exclusion as well as hail exclusion. And that only both of those things can happen only when it's draped, like what you can see here. But hail netting can also be used just overhead to kind of keep hail off of trees, which can save a crop during certain years, and it will help exclude birds. I did not mention bird netting here, but this is a good time to mention that bird netting is going to be pretty essential for certain berry crops, especially if you are thinking about growing honeyberries, for example, as well as grapes. Hail netting will exclude birds, whereas bird netting will not exclude insects. And then this is, a topic that's very dear to me, but thinking a lot about pruning and then crop load management. This is something I spend a lot of time on, and we do have workshops. Um, that will be coming up this year again. If you're interested in learning about apple pruning, you get a guide with this workshop and then get to kind of hang out, learn about pruning in depth and practice pruning in a local orchard. So I'd say stay tuned and look. Well, actually, we have those links up. So if you're interested in that, I think Lauren has the link that she can throw into the chat there. So in general, how much pruning is needed, right, might influence whether you choose to grow a crop or not. Maybe you're just not interested in getting into pruning that much. And so, I have a spectrum here. I guess it's a little bit debatable. So take it as, maybe smaller bit of information here. But for things like grapes, they're going to be heavily pruned. You can't get away with not pruning grapes. Apples, it's going to depend on the training system. Shrub crops like blueberries and honeyberries are going to really benefit from pruning, especially if, again, if there's a lot of fruit that is, there's not a lot of gaps in the canopy that can make harvest really difficult. And then as branches get older for these shrub crops, you need more renewal. Peaches, I'm just throwing it up there. I'm not encouraging everybody to go out and grow peaches in Minnesota by any means, but they grow fruit on younger wood, so they are pruned a little bit more intensively. And then things like raspberries, for example, you have summer bearing where basically you're going to have fruit on what are called floor canes. So it's a 1-year-old cane that fruits, and those get removed after they're done fruiting during the season. But for fall bearing raspberries, you're just cutting them all the way back to the ground every single year, so they can be a little bit easier to manage. But they are continuously harvested. So for some people, that's not something that they're interested in. Your goals for pruning, again, you're influencing the plant's architecture, how it's shaped, where it's growing into. Branches get older year after year. So again, keeping all of that in mind, you might see a little branch that's crossing over another during one year, and all of a sudden, years later, you're like, oh, that little branch got pretty big. Wish I would have removed it. Increasing airflow, especially sunlight, though, to try to increase fruiting in parts of the canopy rather than just having, if you don't prune, oftentimes you'll just get fruit on the perimeter of a canopy, which is not necessarily a great maximization of space or use of space. Balancing crop load, so it's especially important for grapes. If you just let it continue to fruit as much as it wants, it's draining all the reserves of the plant. So keeping that balance can be really helpful to maintain those reserves so it can be sustainable year after year. It can overwinter well. And then thinking about plant health in some ways, sometimes you might be removing diseased wood, but again, bringing in that airflow, good airflow can always help mitigate diseases a little bit. So again, here's just another example showing what it looks like. You have a certain amount of energy in the plant every year based on how much it's photosynthesizing, how much wood it has available, and how large its root system is. And it can either put that towards making fruit, or it can put it towards non-fruiting, again, building roots, building shoots and woody tissue. So just recognize that there's kind of this trade-off between the two. And then thinking about which tools you might want to get a hold of, generally for larger branches. So, not as much for smaller fruit crops, but you'll want to think about having a good saw. There's so many different features about tools I'm not going to go into today, but making sure you have something you're comfortable with, something that folds up, something that's easy to carry. Um, there are, for pruning loppers, which are going to be having the long handles, and shears with the shorter handles. There are some that ratchet, so they make it a little bit easier to cut down a branch all at once. There are some that are left-handed. There are some that are for smaller hands. There are electric tools. And then you can see this larger kit here. This is a pneumatic tool, which is very expensive, but effective like an electric tool would be. So come to a workshop to learn more. We have a number of workshops going on this year, and this is an area that I believe strongly in and go into depth with. So you're welcome to think a little bit more about that. We don't have one in every county, but we do have, I think, at least 5 different apple workshops going on this year and 2 different grape workshops. And you might be able to find more. Sometimes master gardeners are also putting on workshops, although their curriculum might be a little bit different than what I teach. So fruit thinning, you influenced how much fruit is on a crop based on pruning, but crops like apples and other tree fruits need to be thinned even more. So apples produce fruit on a cluster. and you only actually want one fruit in that whole cluster, and you want about a fist distance between clusters or between fruits. But there's chemical ways to thin. You can thin during bloom, you can thin after fruits have set. But hand thinning, again, if you just have a small amount of fruit, hand thinning is going to be really effective, especially if you do it early on. There are some varieties like Honeycrisp that go into what's called biennial bearing. So if you don't thin them, you might start to see cropping every other year rather than every single year having a consistent crop. So we'll finish today's talk. Got just a few minutes left here. Talking about yield and fruit quality influence points. Again, so thinking about harvest and storage handling is this next part here. So as fruits begin to ripen, basically their sugars start to build up and their acids decrease while they start to soften and those aromas start to come out and the flavors really increase. Um, and so this is the part that you've really worked hard to get to. So you want to make sure that you're harvesting at a place where you're not harvesting too early because that leads to sour fruit, and bringing sour fruit to a market can really be disappointing. Oftentimes, local fruit is more expensive. So for a customer who has never tasted, a honeyberry before, or a currant, or a local table grape, to have something that isn't actually representative of how ripe it could get can be disappointing and can kind of skew whether people think local fruit is worth eating. So looking for color, texture, scent, and then bricks is basically a measurement of sugar levels. Um, so a lot of fruits that, this is typical for wine grapes, but there's a lot of other fruits, including honeyberries and other fruits where you actually do want to measure how the sugar levels are. And there's a tool called a refractometer. I think I have a slide here next that can really easily do this. And then thinking about the starch to sugar ratio, this is where iodine testing comes into place for apples. Again, just trying to see how ripe it is. And maybe you do starch testing along with tasting. And then year after year, maybe you don't necessarily need to do as much starch testing because you have a good idea of where they're at. So I didn't have a picture of a refractometer on here, but they are a tool to measure sugars, and they are actually pretty easy to use. They come in a lot of different models, but there are cheaper ones that just work just as fine as other ones that I would recommend. And then storage. Do you have enough storage to store fruits? Are you planning to store fruit? How quickly does the fruit need to be cooled? If you cool it down too quickly, are there consequences to that? Some apples that you need to kind of have a step-by-step slower cooling process. And then how long will you store it for? Going back to apples again, apples that are going to be stored for a long time really benefit from being harvested actually a little bit earlier. If they're harvested too late, they can get have texture issues if they've been stored for like, multiple months. But in Minnesota, for the most part, we're moving through these pretty quickly. And then will fruit be processed, frozen, eaten fresh? That all changes your storage needs. So with that, we did get through all the slides, which is great. And this is just a QR code to our newsletter, and I just recommend for folks who are interested, follow along, reach out if there are topics that you're confused about, want more information about, please let me know, and I can try to incorporate those in the future. And I can take a few questions here. Sorry.
I don't see any in the chat, so if anybody wants to unmute, please do. You're more than welcome to.
If there are no more questions, we just thank you all for being here today. Sorry, I got a little dry throated at the end there. But thanks for joining us and look forward. This is a webinar series. I don't know what the next one is. I don't know if you have that information, Lauren, but there will
Can
be, yeah, weekly webinars happening. Yeah, go ahead,
can I
Pat.
ask just a quick question? It's
Absolutely.
probably a little bit of off topic. Do you have any suggestions on how to start a maple tree grove for syruping?
Oh, that's a really great question. And I don't personally work with maple trees, but there's a number of local educators in Minnesota who have done workshops with maple trees. And I think like Michigan State University might have more resources as well. But Pat, if you do email me, my email address is WIMM0035 at umn.edu. I can try to connect you with someone who would have more information on that. That's a really great question.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. All right. Well, with that, again, just
Madeline,
oh,
there was one question
one
in the
more. Okay.
chat.
Sorry.
Can you give advice for weed suppression in an already planted orchard, young trees, and no chemicals?
Yeah, I think, again, depending on the weeds you're dealing with, like if you're dealing with aggressive grasses, versus annuals, I did actually there, so we do have one webinar that's actually on the UW Fruit YouTube page, where I did another presentation on this topic of organic weed management. But it does get tricky once things are established. Mulching can be helpful, but sometimes people will get weeds that are also germinating on top of the mulch. And then there's some things, again, like grasses that you still may need to till even next to your rows. So one grower that I've worked with, Chris McGuire, who's a part of the Organic Fruit Growers Association, he gave that talk with me, and he does a combination of mulching, but also he has a special tillage equipment on his tractor that will kind of cut through those edges of the rows to try to keep out any grasses that might be encroaching. I mean, there are considerations for things, trying to use animals and things like that. But again, what's practical for you, I think, is really going to depend on your farm. And then there are some, very superficial chemicals that are organic approved, like home plate, but the timing of that's going to be really important. So if it is a small amount, hand weeding is going to be the most helpful. And then mulching, again, depending on your budget and all of that, is another option as well. But yeah, again, you can reach out to me by email if you want a few more details on that.
Hey, I have a question over here.
Sure. Hey.
Hi, I'm not Mari. I'm just logged in through her account. Mari is also here, but um, we have an existing 3 acre apple orchard as well as a lot of various native fruits and other bushes and shrubs and cane fruits. But one of our persistent issues is with voles in the winter,
Oh, sure.
and in the past rabbits with
Hmm.
girdling the trees. And we use tubes and that sort of thing. But as they get bigger, they're still vulnerable to it, and it doesn't. I just wonder what growers do about voles.
Yeah. So at the Horticulture Research Station, or the Research Center, I know that they do a lot of baiting around their grapevines. But again, yeah, so there's, basically killing them is the main thing. I don't know, again, even with the tree guards, right? Sometimes they can get like right at the base of it, so that can be a big issue. But yeah, I would say trapping, is
So
probably. Mhm.
we do trap.
You do. Okay.
It's
Yeah,
relatively ineffective in the winter. We have a lot of habitat on the farm.
sure.
But in terms of baits, we're organic, so we're limited to the baits, and we're also very
Okay.
wary of any baits that would affect our birds of prey, which
Okay,
we
sure.
consider a
Yeah, yeah.
benefit to the farm. So that's kind of our hesitation there. We do have a good deal of luck catching them in our high tunnels with traps
Okay.
and trapping them,
Okay.
but out in the orchards,
It's more tricky.
we just haven't had any luck.
Sure. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks for bringing that to my attention. I don't have like a really great answer for that. But yeah, you definitely can connect with me, and I don't know, as more things come up. I think wildlife has been one of those topics that needs more attention. Ends up being a bigger issue than, yeah, than you think it would be. But yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks for asking.
It looks like pests are fairly common. Gophers too, somebody said, and farm cats.
Nice. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
did put the schedule in the chat, so if anybody wants to see what the next series episodes are about, they are in the chat. So
Yeah, and I don't know when, yeah, we will be posting these, but I'm not sure when that's going to happen. I'll try to be getting mine up. We have to sort of close caption things and then make sure their captions are accurate. So that takes a little bit of time, but they will be posted and maybe we'll put up a blog post that just kind of says, hey, everything's up on YouTube now for those who missed it. So,
Yeah, and Allison's asking if you can put your email up for future contact.
oh, sure, absolutely. Yep, that's my email there. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. I don't do a lot of one-on-one meetings, but especially if you're kind of in the Rochester area, there are some times where I can do farm visits and things like that. So, yeah, thanks for everyone being here today, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a future webinar. My next webinar I'm giving is going to be on supporting pollinators for specialty crop farms. I think that's March 11th. So, all right, well, we'll end it there. Thanks, everyone.